think that's how everybody should start. Just little positive reinforcement that you did.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that most people, so when we think about personality, like people are really precious about their personality. They're like, "Oh my gosh, like it's who I am," right? I think it's important to to define it like the way that we do it in like in academia or like in my research, right? And so personality is not your tastes, it's not your sense of humor, it's not your likes or dislikes. I think of personality as like kind of where you fall on five big traits that that people kind of vary on. And so the first one is neuroticism. That's your tendency to experience negative emotions. People are all over the place on that. Some people are really high in neuroticism. I would describe myself as a pretty sensitive person. I think it makes me, like I said, like a more empathetic therapist. And then there are people that are really low, really stoic. And most people think, oh, like it's better to be not very emotional, right? But like I've had friends tell me that they get in trouble with their wives because their wives will come home and be like, "This thing happened to me at work," and their husbands will be like, "Yeah, you want to watch TV?" They're like not validating enough because they don't have those strong reactions. So that's neuroticism. Then you have extroversion, which includes sociability, but also like your energy level and your tendency to experience positive emotions. Then you have conscientiousness, which we've talked about, and that's kind of our, being organized and reliable and achievement striving versus being more spontaneous or maybe a little bit impulsive. Then there's agreeableness, like that's how well you get along with other people, how cooperative you are. And again, like you would think that like being not very agreeable is a bad thing, and it can be in extremes, but like being too agreeable and you're kind of a doormat. And then the last one is openness, right? So how open are you to like new ideas, experiences, and aesthetics? And like I said at the beginning, it's hard to change these traits, right? You really have to change how you're thinking and how you're behaving. And people can really only sustain that if there is some motivator, right? It's important to them. So like if someone's like, well, I want to be more extroverted, but I don't actually have like a reason for that. Like, I don't need to do more public speaking. I don't need to go to parties. I'm actually really content. Then like, why? Right. But if you are a person who has a business to promote and you need to really develop that trait, I think it's really important that people know that that's possible. And so our science tells us, like, when we look at these like longitudinal studies that show how people change on these five traits over time, they're like really changeable. So on average, people become less neurotic, more extroverted. They tend to be more conscientious. They tend to put more value in relationships, and they tend to be less judgmental or more open. And so we're seeing this trajectory. And then in my research, where I'm doing like clinical trial research, so like developing treatment and testing them, we actually see that we get that like naturalistic 20 years of personality change. We can see that in 20 weeks when we actually intentionally do it.
You say that our environment shapes our personality. How much does our childhood affect our personality over time?
Yeah. So that's really interesting and like such an interesting question, right? Because we think about like personality as sort of like being like 50% sort of genetic, right? And then like for most of us, we're being raised in an environment by the people that gave us our genetic material. So is it from the way my parents are acting, or is it because of the DNA that they gave me that's like causing me to be a certain way? Um, but actually, like contrary to what you would think, most of the personality change and the variability that we see happens after people leave their family of origin, right? It happens when people are adults. So we see more change actually in adulthood than we see in childhood. So a couple things that we do, basically in therapy, but like you don't really need to be in therapy to do these things. They're just like kind of good good mental health things to do. The first thing that I always do with patients in therapy is talk about values, right? So, like, what's important to you? And this is where we get back to like your motivation, because if you're living in line with your values, with the traits that you already have and the way that you're already thinking and behaving, then like, great, you're done. And so when I think about values, I consider them like in different life domains, right? So we usually talk about 11 different life domains. There's like your interpersonal ones, so like your romantic partnership, your like what you're like as a parent, what you're like as like an adult family member, right? Like to your parents, to your siblings, what you're like as a friend, And then there's more like career and achievement striving education, right? Like what do you want your career to be about? Like what's important to you here? Education, right? And so education could be formal, or it could be like, I'm just the type of person that always needs to be learning something new, whether it's like crafts or a new language, or I take, people differ on that, right? Like some people, I read this thing that like, the majority of people after they graduate from college never read another book, but like, that's just people have different things that are important. Then there's more like spirituality, culture or cultural traditions, citizenship, and then health and wellness. And so the important thing to stress to folks is that you can't like rate all of these domains as 10 out of 10 important, because there's not enough like time or energy in the day. So like it's okay that there's variability on what's important to you. And so usually then we identify like, okay, so you're saying like that your family, I mean, I can use me as an example, right? Like my family, like raising my kids is really important to me. And then my other sort of really important domain is work and career. And like those two are like in conflict, right? Because the more the harder I work at work, the less time I'm at home. When I think about like my personality traits, as so I sort of cultivated this like achievement striving conscientious personality trait. And that personality trait, like when it gets like too far, makes me, or anybody, right, like rigid and perfectionistic. And so, realizing like, especially after having kids, like, okay, I need to like back that off a little bit. Like, what does that look like? So so really like defining with people, well, what does it look like to live in accordance with your values, right? And so, well, being home more, like, okay, it's 5 o'clock, I'm going home, even though I didn't finish my thing, right? So we really like concretely define those things, and then we talk about like what are the traits that would help get you there, like it's kind of like almost like bringing down that conscientiousness to like an adaptive level versus the sort of like perfectionistic, I have to finish all the things I said I'd do. So we really start out defining like why we want to develop certain traits. Often I'll ask people to kind of call to mind folks in their lives or folks that they acquaintances that they know of that they really like value, or that they just impress them, right? Like what are their traits? And really like, what would they do in this situation? So kind of like defining where our goal is and also the why. Then we move into more of like our cognitive behavioral strategies. And so I didn't say this at the beginning, but your personality, I told you what it wasn't. It's not your tastes. It's not your your sense of humor. It's your characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And so cognitive behavioral therapy, what I'm trained to do, it's like changing your thoughts and changing your behavior. And so like your personality is how you think and how you behave. So one of the things we do with the cognitive work is like figure out if you have any self-limiting beliefs that are keeping you stuck. In my case, like with too high conscientiousness, right? Am I telling myself, people are counting on me, I'm going to let people down if I don't finish this today? I'm only as reliable as like today's task. Am I telling myself stuff like that? And like, well, could I, is there something else I could say? The flip of that I always get with my patients is, you probably heard this or know this, right? Like, I need the adrenaline of the last minute to start studying. People say that all the time, right? And that, or like people that wait till the last minute to pack to move. That's another kind of like variation on that. And that's a belief. It's a self-limiting belief. Like you don't literally need adrenaline to open a book, but you're telling yourself that. And if you're telling yourself that, it's going to make it more likely that you're going to watch Netflix and not study. So we identify those self-limiting beliefs and we see if there are other things that we can tell ourselves instead, right? Like, okay, well, I actually am like physically capable of starting to study, even though I don't have adrenaline in this moment, right? And so what we tell ourselves can impact what we do, right? That might increase the likelihood that we might try out a different behavior here, like studying early.
Hey guys, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to our app, Yoga Plus. You will have access to an incredible selection of videos led by top instructors in yoga, fitness, nutrition, and so much more. Download our Yoga Plus app, available on iOS and Android today.